The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. We will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God.
We knew right then that we were going to war. There was no other way out.
December 7th, 1941. The USS West Virginia, in true mountaineer form, received several hits before going down. Gunner's mate Tony Serino of Nicholas County was on the battleship during the attack.
It put fear in us there. We were scared, all right. Torpedoes hit the ships, and they, of course, made holes on the port side, and the ship started sinking there, and I listened to the port side there.
Nearly 67,000 West Virginians responded to the Japanese attack and Germany and Italy's subsequent declaration of war on America. Mountaineers were anxious to bring the war to an end quickly and decisively.
Go ahead and finish the war, fight the Japs and get it over with is what I want to do. About the same thing I guess everybody else wanted to do, I reckon there.
There wasn't any doubt about who the bad guys were, and the country just rose as one. And West Virginia was no different. West Virginians rallied to the call.
I saw many West Virginians during World War II, and they were all eager soldiers, eager to get to the front, eager to participate in the action.
Young men, middle-aged men, were coming to Charleston and standing in line to volunteer to go into the military.
West Virginia State College contributed 600 of the 11,000 black mountaineers joining the armed forces. Charles E. Lowell, president of West Virginia University, watched as hundreds of his students marched off to war.
Enrollment was going down every week. Boys were dropping out of school, and he was trying to encourage them to at least finish that semester.
The percentage of West Virginia men in the war put the state among the top 5 in the nation. Nearly 219,000 mountaineers served in the war.
World War II really enhanced the patriotic spirit of West Virginia soldiers.
We were fighting the good fight, and the objective was quite clear, to win, to eliminate that regime.
West Virginians seemed to be a cut above some of the others who kind of held back and waited until pushed by their commanders in order to get into action.
We took pride in what we did. We didn't want to be second best. We wanted to be best.
I'd rather be on a combat patrol with a West Virginian than any other soldier from any other state, because we looked after one another.
You would go to great extremes not to let your fellow comrades down or your unit down.
Nearly 200 years had passed since the backwoodsmen of Western Virginia first took up arms to defend their homes and families. Over those years, the mountaineers' sense of family had grown. It was natural for the 20th century West Virginian to view fellow soldiers from other states and other nations as family.
We were all one. We had our differences, but we were still one.
This sense of family helped 11 West Virginians earn the Congressional Medal of Honor.
It was just a very definite desire to do the job, do it to the very best of their trained ability that they had, and it so happened that what they did was witnessed by people who recognized it.
Williams earned the Medal of Honor on Iwo Jima. Heavy Japanese machine gun fire had prevented forward movement of American tanks. Marine Corporal Williams volunteered his services as flamethrower and demolitions engineer. 4 hours passed as he silenced one gun after another. The Marion County native once charged enemy riflemen as they tried to stop him with bayonets. The Japanese succumbed to his flamethrower. Herschel Woodrow Williams was directly instrumental in neutralizing one of the island's best defended strongholds. Sergeant J.J. Spurrier of Mercer County earned the Medal of Honor after single-handedly killing 25 Germans and taking 4 prisoners in a French village. Spurrier became the most decorated Army Ground Force volunteer of the war. Felix Stump of Wood County commanded the aircraft carriers Enterprise and Lexington during the war. He earned 2 Navy Crosses, the Army's Distinguished Service Medal, the Silver Star, and several other awards for exceptionally meritorious service. Admiral Stump later received the Navy's Distinguished Service Medal as Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet.
He was such an outstanding person in the Navy and had a great war record. We were just so proud of him that he was a West Virginian.
It was Adjutant General Fox of Braxton County who presented Admiral Stump with the West Virginia Distinguished Service Medal in 1954.
On behalf of all the nations at war with Japan.
Lieutenant General Richard Sutherland of Randolph County served as General Douglas MacArthur's Chief of Staff in the Pacific Theater. Sutherland was present for the Japanese surrender in 1945. Major George Spanky Roberts, a graduate of West Virginia State College's civilian pilot program, became the first black cadet in the Army Air Corps. The Marion County native became the first African-American to command the Negro pilots of the 99th and 332nd Pursuit Squadrons. Charles E. Chuck Yeager of Lincoln County is best known for his daring flight of the Bell X-1, breaking the sound barrier in 1947. But he earned his shot at the stars as an ace Air Corps pilot in the Second World War.
Chuck Yeager is kind of the typical patriotic American. Very soft-spoken, very low-key about it. But in just talking to him, you know that any threat against the United States is a personal threat against him.
It just so happened that I was at the right place at the right time, and World War II obviously was the most memorable days of my life because it involved an awful lot of combat. Of all the fighter pilots involved in combat, 11% of them shot down 90% of the airplanes that were destroyed in World War II. And so when you look at the commonality of this 11%, it's amusing. Without exception, every one of them was raised as a rural kid. And obviously, that fit me perfectly.
And while in the European Theater of Operations, he flew 13 combat missions, on one of which he shot down 5 German planes. And on his 8th combat mission, he was shot down over German-occupied France.
The way I laughingly put it, there's not a German alive that can catch a West Virginian in the woods. You travel at night, sleep in haystacks in the daytime, and steal chickens or turnips to live.
With the aid of the French underground, Yeager eventually returned to action.
Because the reason really anybody serves in the military is to fight.
Yeager went on to fly 127 combat missions during the Vietnam War.
I never saw a coward from West Virginia, but everybody was scared now. It's terrible to go through some of the things that we went through. It's indignities you wouldn't believe.
Mountaineers, in several instances, were captured and forced to endure death marches, intense labor, and mental anguish as prisoners of war. For example, Lawrence Rains of Kanawha County spent 3.5 years as a prisoner of the Japanese at Bataan in the Philippine Islands.
People tried to get out of the camp and was recaptured, and they brought them in, beheaded them, and then put their heads on a pole and carried them around through the camps.
The time that I spent in the prison camp was the worst in my life. But I was raised up very poor, and that's what made me strong enough to survive in the Army like I did. We had to fight to survive sometimes during the Depression. You know, we worked hard. We had to raise what we eat. My family did.
I looked out after myself when a young boy. And most of these boys today can't even fix their own breakfast. Most of us was rural people, and we didn't have a car to go everywhere in. It was nothing to us to learn to walk 6 miles out and back, and in the Army you had to learn to walk, and a lot of us raised in the cities didn't. Rural boys was pretty well adapted and ready for it.
More than 5,800 West Virginians were killed in the war. Both men and women of the Mountain State devoted themselves to gallant military service. Jack Feller of Wyoming County especially remembers a student at West Virginia University. The two had met as freshmen in 1941.
And she came back again to enroll as a junior in college. And I said, well, what have you been doing the last 4 years. She said, "Do you think I'm going to stay here in college where you boys are in service?" I joined the service too.
Appalachian writer Mary Lee Settle of Kanawha County served in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force and at the Office of War Information in London. She endured German bombings alongside the many people of Britain.
There's some everyday bravery in this place that makes me proud to be here. What we see over here isn't very pretty sometimes. It's hard and dirty and unromantic war for these people.
During World War II, we had over 2,000 women serving as aircraft mechanics, Army personnel, nurses.
And the head of the Army Nurse Corps was Colonel Florence Blanchfield, born and raised in Martinsburg, West Virginia. And I wanted to go to take care of somebody else's brothers, like they would take care of mine if they needed them.
West Virginia men and women, meanwhile, gave it their all on the home front.
This is war, and as the nation mobilizes its might, it turns to West Virginia, where so much of its strength is concentrated. West Virginia resources now are called upon to keep 'em marching, keep 'em flying, and keep 'em shooting.
There's no such thing as a good war for the people that are involved. But the cause was just. The people in West Virginia and elsewhere recognized it early on. There was sort of a determination and a stoicism on the part of the people.
We were a very, very patriotic group, and the people that were left behind, the mothers and fathers and so forth, they got right into the act of work in defense plants.
The people on the home front in World War II were willing to sacrifice, and did sacrifice, and they needed to sacrifice.
Mountaineers purchased more war bonds than expected, and as in World War I, they grew their own food. West Virginians, once again, accepted the conditions of war. Fayette County Boy Scouts pitched in when called on to recycle.
These boys throughout the war were very well known for collecting newspaper and other paper for salvage, and this paper would be recycled and put into the war effort. They collected many tons, and in fact, even when the war ended, they had stacked and available for shipment 12 tons of paper they had collected just within the last 90 days.
Rationing paper, sugar, and other scarce items became the norm.
You couldn't get a can of peas at the store without a ration point. And you couldn't buy gasoline, you couldn't buy tires. Well, you couldn't hardly buy tires if you had the stamps. And you couldn't buy whiskey if you're a whiskey man. Hardly anything.
I was in the coal mines at that time, and I tried to enlist. I went to Charleston to enlist, and they wouldn't take me because I was a coal miner. Said they needed the coal worse than they needed me.
Saunders helped the Mountain States supply more than 600 million tons of coal to fuel the war.
Lots of coal miners stayed in southern West Virginia and mined the coal that made the steel, that built the munitions industry into the arsenal for democracy.
As the U.S. had replaced Germany as the chief chemical maker in the First World War, America replaced Japan as the primary supplier of rubber in World War II. The world's largest synthetic rubber plant was built in the Kanawha Valley.
West Virginia's industry certainly contributed a great deal to America's war effort in World War II. And a good example of this is the Elkin Metals Company plant, which became the world's largest ferroalloy plant, employing over 2,400 people. This plant produced thousands of tons of ferroalloys necessary in the production of armor steel for battleships and tanks and airplanes and what have you.
The Valley's U.S. Naval Ordnance Plant made gun barrels for ships and tanks, while men and women built patrol boats and other ocean-going vessels on the shores of the Ohio in Mason County. The war affected life from one end of the state to the other. The Greenbrier Hotel served as a detention center during the first months of the war. More than 1,000 German, Italian, and Japanese diplomats and their family remained till exchanged for their American counterparts. The resort, under the name of Ashford General Hospital, also treated 20,000 soldiers and veterans later in the war. Naval officers were groomed at Bethany College in Brooke County, at West Virginia University in Monongalia County, and at other schools throughout the state. The Army readied soldiers for northern Italy's terrain in Grant and Tucker counties. West Virginia State College's pilot training program prepared men and women to serve in combat and on the home front.
And people were involved in the Civilian Defense Corps, so many things that affected them on the home front, even though they were not fighting the battle. Everyone who remained on the home front became active in the war in some way.
God bless America. And I've never heard a song sung with so much enthusiasm and so much feeling.
The end of the war in 1945 sparked celebrations throughout the world. Army Sergeant Art Bennett of Harrison County was celebrating in Germany when a military policeman stopped to investigate the activities of Bennett's comrades.
They'd been drinking a little bit and they were singing the West Virginia hills, and the master sergeant says, "Where are you from?" I said, "I'm from Clarksburg, West Virginia." And just like that, the tears came in his eyes, and he says, "I'm from Bluefield." He says, "God bless you. God bless West Virginia, and God bless the United States."
On June 25, 1950, war erupted in a divided Asian land.
I was laying in my bunk in Fort Sill, Oklahoma, when the war broke out in Korea. I'd never heard of Korea. You know, I didn't know anything about where Korea was.
Both North and South Korea wished to unify the country under their own control. The North Koreans invaded South Korea under the assumption that the United States would not intervene.
But the United States did take action, sending a task force of 406 soldiers. West Virginians joined the nation in supporting American involvement.
We had all the confidence in the world that we could take care of any problem that would occur there.
We had to stop communism somewhere and had to go over there wherever it was to stop them, I reckon there. I was all for it.
Task Force Smith was sent to the front to hold the line and bolster South Korean troops. The Americans were ill-equipped, poorly trained, understrength, and very young. Private Kenny Shadrick of Wyoming County was part of the first bazooka team to fire on an enemy tank.
The round bounced off the tank. He looked up and he took a hit.
"They've got Shadrick," a matter-of-fact voice called, right in the chest. The 19-year-old was the first American and the first of 900 West Virginians to die in battle. A higher percentage of mountaineers served and died than men from any other state.
Our men were being trapped, our men were being killed, they were being slaughtered, and we still termed it as just a police action.
And they sent us over with BB guns to stop those tanks.
It seemed that our government was failing to supply them with the backing that they did us in World War II.
The Korean conflict, unlike the Second World War, had little impact on day-to-day life in America.
We had a lot of casualties up there. They had a lot of guts, though. When they got hit, they didn't cry out or anything. They really stood there and took it like a man.
About the only way that you knew we were in a war was through the news. As far as everything else in this country, nothing seemed to change. It went on just about as usual.
President Harry Truman termed U.S. involvement in Korea as a police action. Congress never declared war on North Korea, nor did the government call on Americans to sacrifice, to supply troops with the very best.
The people on the home front began to get upset. I know I did, and many others did, because we felt the soldiers dying in Korea were no different from the soldiers dying in World War II. And in World War II, we classified that as a war.
Most of the 112,000 West Virginians in the conflict knew what they were doing. They were being shot at.
It's not a question of, am I going to get shot? You're going to get shot. It's just a matter of where you get shot and how bad.
The Air Guard sent engineers and flyers from West Virginia units when called on.
Most of the airmen and pilots that went into the Korean conflict were split up. They weren't kept as a unit, and they filled in wherever necessary, and they did an excellent job.
Mountaineers again served honorably throughout the Korean conflict. For example, Army Sergeant Cornelius Charlton of Raleigh County became the second black to earn the Medal of Honor since the Spanish-American War. He led 3 charges on a heavily defended enemy hill position. Charlton, after refusing medical aid for a severe chest wound, charged another stronghold and rallied the enemy single-handedly. Further wounding resulted in his own death. 3 other soldiers representing West Virginia also earned the Congressional Medal of Honor. Mountaineers, from the first day on, took great pride in fighting for their country and fighting against communism.
And when they came back, the attitude was still there. People still felt good about it.
If we hadn't have done it, well, I guess all of Korea today would be communist, and maybe a lot of other countries. I mean, that was the sort of the challenge that had to be met.
The fighting ended in the summer of 1953. United Nations forces had managed to hold the communist invasion back.
I think that was the beginning of the end of communism.
Mountaineers, though, saw no clear victory. The spread of communism was not crushed, but merely contained. West Virginians began to question America's tactics in confronting the enemy.
We backed up. We gave in to them. We had the ability and we had the power, but we refused to use it.
We didn't win. It was a draw, and we came home individually. There was no fanfare one way or the other.
West Virginians, regardless of their feelings for the war itself, welcomed mountaineers home with open arms.
And the people here made me welcome here in my hometown. They made me welcome because to them, I guess I was a war hero.
I'd like to see peace in Vietnam. My brother's there now, and I wish he were home.
The Vietnam War was one that tore our country and our state apart in terms of support and opposition to that war.
We didn't accomplish a thing over there. It was just a disaster. We lost so many people.
The war was indecisive, inconclusive. We didn't have clear objectives.
Why couldn't we go all out and win the thing without drawing it off over many, many years? It was frustrating.
I began to see that this was a fruitless operation that we were involved in, and that it was more of a civil war rather than a threat to the United States of America and its allies.
Another police action, the war took a heavy toll on West Virginia between 1965 and 1973. The state, sending 118,000 mountaineers into action, suffered the highest percentage of casualties. To date, 24 remain unaccounted for.
Many West Virginians regarded this as being just another patriotic call to arms.
Being a West Virginian, I felt it was my duty to be there. I wanted to be a part of that tradition. It meant something to me.
I went because I felt that I was needed. Nurses were in short supply in the military. There's never enough nurses in the military. And I wanted to serve in Vietnam. When I first went there, we worked 12-hour shifts. We were always busy. The choppers always flew night and day.
If it were not for the patriotism of those 1,200 West Virginia women, some of these guys would not be alive today.
In other parts of the country, other protesters were blaming the soldiers. They were spitting on them. They were throwing rocks and rotten eggs at them.
Most of them were treated like dirt, you know, during Vietnam. And they weren't given the credit that they deserve. You know, it's the politicians who really did the dirty work in that. And it was the soldiers who, you know, was following orders as they were sworn in to do.
When we served, we weren't thinking in terms of whether it was popular or not popular. As far as I was concerned as a Vietnam veteran, I was serving my country.
Those of us who protested the war here in this area never really blamed the soldiers. Critical of the government, absolutely. Critical of our involvement in Vietnam, absolutely. But never critical of the soldiers. We never blamed the soldiers.
The West Virginian fighting in Vietnam was unable to benefit from the camaraderie as much as mountaineers had in previous wars.
He didn't go together as a unit. He didn't go together with his friends that he had in school, or his next-door neighbor, or his boss, or the people that he knows in his community. He went by himself.
It's a long time over there. It's a long time for us who served there and for those who are serving there now. So many of you know war is harsh and it is lonely.
War is not pretty. There's no way to describe war. It's not something that's pleasant. But if you live through it, it's an experience that you learn by, because you learn the heights and the depths of what man can do to each other, really.
Claude Hurst of Wayne County has written about his experiences as a U.S. Marine in Vietnam.
You really can't get the sense of combat or war until you've been there. And I experienced war and I grew up a little bit.
We had airstrikes day in and day out, and the whole skyline lit up. I was scared. I wished 1,000 times that I was back in West Virginia.
We got a lot of rocket attacks out of the hills, and that was quite an experience when they start coming in when you're asleep and you have to scramble.
Mountaineers distinguished themselves again and again in the line of fire. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Rogers of Fayette County was among 5 West Virginians to earn the Congressional Medal of Honor in Vietnam.
He could have well stayed in his command bunker underground relatively safe. But when they began to penetrate, that is, the North Vietnamese, or Viet Cong, began to penetrate his perimeter, he went to the point where the attack was, jumped into the gun pits, and fought beside and with his men through the night, though he was wounded several times in the action.
The colonel was later promoted to the rank of Major General. Rogers is one of 11 West Virginia State College graduates to obtain the rank of general, and all but 4 served in Vietnam.
West Virginia was well represented in the Vietnam conflict.
Many deliberately volunteered for some of the toughest units.
Brown, a colonel in Vietnam, later became the first African-American in the Army Intelligence Corps to attain the rank of Brigadier General. Thomas Joseph Lopez of Fayette County enlisted as a seaman in the U.S. Navy in 1959. 10 years later, Lieutenant Lopez commanded a river division near the Cambodian border.
I really learned how important people are, with a number of firefights each week where my men were in, and myself at times. It could be life or death every day, and the idea was to keep your men alive and to try and maintain that area in which you were in as very peaceful. And I think we did that very well.
Lopez later commanded the USS Stump, then the flagship of West Virginia. The destroyer was named to honor Admiral Felix Stump of Wood County. I myself flew over 60 combat missions in Vietnam from the deck of the aircraft carrier Saratoga. This experience, in all probability, was instrumental in my being selected to serve as a space shuttle pilot. But as with my fellow mountaineer Vietnam vets, proud of our service to America, I returned to a disenchanted nation.
People have to demonstrate just with their presence that they are concerned about this war, and it has to stop. It can't drag on and on and on.
Life on the home front, in some ways, went on as it had in past wars. Mountaineers shipped cards, letters, and care packages en masse to the battlefront. A leading chemical supplier, the Kanawha Valley also produced personnel carriers and other armored vehicles to combat communism. West Virginians, by and large, supported their men and women in Vietnam, but they were ill prepared to receive returning vets, fresh from the battlefield.
Homecoming for the Vietnam veteran was not a very pleasant thing. People were filtering into their community, 1, 2, or 4 or 5 at a time, and you couldn't have parades, and you couldn't really recognize those people because you didn't know when they were coming home or even who they were.
I had many veterans say they came back and people say, "Hi, where you been?"
You could be in a rice paddy shooting somebody, and in 12 hours, you know, fly home and be on the streets of a small town like Huntington, and nothing going on, you know, and it's a big change. I think it was a shock.
Just completely disconnected. That was the sense that they had, and they were.
West Virginians found it difficult to help returning mountaineers leave the war behind. Soldiers relived the horrors of Vietnam and their struggle to resume a normal life in the mountain state.
Some battalions are known as butcher battalions, some are known as the headhunters, some carry hatchets.
We were treated great, and they were not, and they felt disgraced. And I'm not so sure about what we didn't cause them to feel like that.
Mountaineers were often unable to come to terms with frustration over the war and loyalty to their soldiers.
People just didn't really know how to treat you. They didn't know how to talk to you about Vietnam.
In World War II, soldiers came home at the end of the war as victors in groups, and not very quickly. In the process, they were getting the opportunity to decompress, as it were, from the experience, an opportunity that was not afforded to the Vietnam veteran.
I think that's why there is a lot of delayed stress.
The Vietnam experience gave mountaineers very little reason to return home with pride, save the knowledge that they had done their duty. West Virginians in previous military conflicts had either defeated the enemy or had at least held the foe at bay. The removal of troops in 1973 failed to bring victory or peace to America.
They don't give Purple Hearts for emotional, mental, or psychological wounds, but you better believe they're out there, especially with our Vietnam brethren. They're veterans. They deserve respect.
The call to arms again came in 1990 in response to Iraq's invasion of Kuwait.
It was a clear cause to stop Iraq from controlling perhaps the majority of the oil supply in the Middle East and gaining undue political influence because of it.
It was pictured as good against evil, America against a Hitler's type of threat again.
We are the sole remaining superpower, as it turns out, in the world today. And in that regard, we certainly have responsibilities for peace, for security, for stability, and for freedom.
Nearly 23,000 West Virginia men and women served during Operation Desert Storm, including 12 Reserve and 10 National Guard units.
We got volunteers who were really waiting in line to serve and to really go in harm's way. We'd say we'd need 20 volunteers in the National Guard, we'd get 50.
And there were a lot of our friends and a lot of our students out of junior ROTC and Huntington High that I knew that were over there. And all of them did a great job. And all of them came back proud of the fact they'd been there.
Civic and veterans organizations assisted families as mothers, brothers, sisters, and fathers went off to war.
When I went off to war, basically every person in West Virginia was behind me.
Mountaineers shipped food baskets, sent videotaped messages, and made long-distance phone calls to the Persian Gulf.
They gave us a lot of encouragement and a lot of willpower to go on. Because at times you felt like just saying, I don't want to do this no more.
Vice Admiral Douglas Katz of Mercer County served as a battle group commander on the USS America. Katz personally sent pilots into combat the first night of Operation Desert Storm.
You worry, you wonder, and you wait. And they came back 7, 8 hours later, and successfully, every single one of them, and I'll never forget that. Big joy in my heart.
Iraq surrendered in April of 1991, 8 months after the invasion of Kuwait.
We started driving into Kuwait, and one guy said, "Thank you, America. Thank you, America." I was so proud. I was so proud. I wasn't Joe Carmen. To him, I was America.
Perseverance and determination will always get you ahead. But it wasn't important to be the best. It just was important to try to be all the time.
Lopez served as a senior military assistant to the Secretary of Defense throughout the conflict.
It was a good feeling to set objectives to drive Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait and then to do that.
West Virginians soon returned home with prestige and honor.
When I came back, it was just overwhelming, overwhelming.
They were missed when they were gone. When they came back to the community, people knew they had been gone.
What I remember so much about Desert Storm was patriotism was flying high. Yellow ribbons on the trees, parades.
People cheering, bands playing. Again, that they felt good about America and what Americans had done.
The night I got home, they threw a surprise party for me at my house. They just blocked off the whole street, and there was probably around 200, 250 people there. And it lasted all night long.
Desert Storm was very near the same enthusiasm and the feeling and the unity that we had in World War II.
It gave Americans a newfound belief in their country, a newfound pride that, hey, we can still do it. You know, we're still on top.
It was a very good feeling to have America behind you during Desert Storm. A different feeling, obviously, than Vietnam.
We didn't want them coming back knowing that they had a unpopular war to deal with. We were behind them 100%, and we did not want them to feel the feelings that we had when we came back and faced the public as we did.
I think for a great many Vietnam vets, there was a sense of homecoming and a sense of the outpouring of love to Vietnam veterans. And there were some twinges of regret that we hadn't had that kind of welcome.
We welcomed them home, which is the way they should be, because they did an excellent job over there. And then we got on about our business of living.
There were no saloons in Orleans because of the hatchet.
This is Captain John Develine speaking, and on behalf of the officers, chief petty officers, and crew of the USS West Virginia, welcome aboard the finest ship in the United States Navy.
Today, the USS West Virginia embodies the spirit of the mountaineer, committed to the preservation of freedom at sea and around the world.
Mountaineers will always be there to fight for their country. They have a lot of pride in their state, a lot of pride in their country. And that pride leads to wanting to protect our country and fight for democracy.
Most West Virginians seem to agree that the mountaineer has done more than his share to defend the people, the values, and the freedoms of Americans. But there is a growing concern that West Virginia's commitment in war will weaken with time. Will future generations fight with the same skill and enthusiasm shown by mountaineers over the last 250 years?
Soldiers of today, they are highly trained in technology. They work as a team. Discipline problems just cannot be tolerated while they're on duty.
We need to get back to the basics of discipline. The families are not disciplining like they did back 30 years ago.
We were doing the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag of our country in school. We were having prayer in school. We were teaching history and what it means to belong and live in America. We're not doing that anymore. And I think it's leaving us a void in our children.
It's a pity that a lot of these young people now are not in the service for about 6 months at least. Teach them how to get out of bed every morning.
I think the advent of television and soft living will produce increasingly softer people in years to come, and will be integrated into the larger society.
There's going to be a few people that are still have the family ties and still the family traditions that's going to carry through.
Family ties and traditions. What role will the family play in West Virginia's future? And what impact will that role have on our state, our nation, this earth of ours? Commitment to family and dedication to country are united in Taylor County. Americans first observed Mother's Day in 1906 in Grafton, the county seat. And West Virginians here have honored their war veterans for more than 125 years, instilling a sense of duty, honor, and pride for generations to come. Children throughout Taylor County meet each Memorial Day to decorate the graves of fallen soldiers in Grafton's National Cemetery.
We need to honor them for their sacrifice.
We teach our children the values that we was taught when we was children, and I think it's going to continue to be that way.
For future generations.
I would want to be loyal to my country and do whatever I could because people have done that for me before.
I have a lot of pride in my country, and I think I would be giving something back to them if I served and fought in the war, as my uncles did before I did.
I don't think that there's any greater privilege for a human being than to have served their nation, either in peace or war.
I think as West Virginians, we're all dedicated, particularly to freedom, to democracy, as we see it not just in our own state or our country, but around the world.
If the worst comes to worst and we have to fight, yeah, we'll fight. But the West Virginians are not too much inclined for our country to serve as policemen of the world.
Wars where the country is actually threatened, I think that most people in this area would join at the drop of a hat and do whatever they could.
I don't know that they'll be as willing as the people have before us, but I think that if it came down to it, they would.
Whether it be in war or a goodwill gesture, they will always be there.
Having been on 6 of the 7 continents, I'll assure you there's nothing better than living in the United States, no matter how bad we might think it is sometimes. And I'm sure we'll always defend it if the government calls on us to do so.
Yes, anytime they're called on, they go. They'll go right today.
I think the West Virginia people as a whole are very proud people, and I think that they will always be willing to fight for their country, for their state.
This spirit and this initiative and this burning patriotism will persist as long as West Virginians love their land, love their soil, and want to protect it from incursions.
I think it's a fierce pride, a sense of patriotism that draws West Virginians together and the military. And I think all West Virginians want to change America to make it better. It's special to be an American. It's special to be a West Virginian.
It's a terrible life. You're living in mud, your feet would even crack open. You're always scared.
You see blood, you see injury, you see death.
To see bodies, men hanging on barbed wire, where they had been there before you and paved the way for you to take your objective, just did something to you.
All the training cannot prepare them for the actual reality of war.
I wouldn't want to go through it again, but I was glad to do it for the country.
West Virginians will do their share in anything they're called on to do, and that includes war.
That's West Virginia for you. Seems like when trouble starts, we all start enlisting.
Time and time again, when the nation's called, West Virginians have answered in a greater number per capita than any other state in the United States.
It's just sort of ingrained into them. That's what Dad and Granddad did, and I'm expected to carry on the tradition.
There's a long tradition of hunting and woodsmanship that naturally lends itself to serving in the military, allows West Virginians to serve well in the military.
Their patriotism leads them to be the best marksmen in the front lines in every war in which America's engaged.
And when they think it chips us down for the nation, they come through.
The reasons mountaineers serve in the military during peacetime are the same for Americans nationwide. But since World War II, more than 80% of our mountaineer veterans have served in wartime. And when it comes time to volunteer for war service, mountaineers are the first to step forward. For more than 250 years it's been that way. Why is it? What leads them to do so?
Duty, loyalty, patriotism, which is kind of hard to come by these days. If you're raised right, you're taught very early in life what patriotism means, to honor your flag and your country.
We love our country, and we think we owe our country something instead of our country owing us.
West Virginians have very strong feelings and opinions about freedom and so on, so they are going to be influenced about those things.
Freedom means so very much to each and every one of us, men and women alike. Without that, we're nothing.
Right here, Nathan.
Mountaineers, since decades before the American Revolution, have fought and died to preserve freedom, protect homes, and defend families.
I don't understand why someone can sit there and call themselves American and live here and not be willing to defend it if it was necessary.
West Virginians are very deep-rooted people. They have a very unique understanding of commitment.
West Virginians are essentially, most West Virginians, honest, patriotic, hardworking, decent people. So many of the things that a soldier has to do and the way he has to be, it's sort of inbred.
I would not ever classify West Virginia as warmonger. West Virginians are peaceful folks, support one another. They're not warmongers. If somebody jumps on us like Pearl Harbor, then we jump on them, but we're not going to create a Pearl Harbor to get a war.
We have strong roots into the soil of West Virginia. Families tend to hang together in West Virginia. We don't scatter as much. And because we're small and close-knit, we're very patriotic people.
People in Appalachia, of course, we're always defensive about our families. Any threat against the family is a direct threat against us. That's cultural. Well, in time of war, it's interesting because we expand our family to take in the entire United States.
Families have fought for generations to secure a peaceful environment in the hills and valleys of West Virginia. War, in many ways, has made West Virginians the Americans they are today. The first Europeans to settle in western Virginia were mostly Scots-Irish, English, Welsh, Dutch, and German, and they shared a common bond.
And in practically every case, those people had been more or less accustomed to war before they ever arrived in West Virginia.
The Germans had fled a region engulfed in war for centuries, while unwelcome Scottish immigrants to Ireland were forced to press onto the New World. The pioneers thought they had finally found a place to call their own.
Many of these people believed that the people who actually used the land, worked the land, cleared the land, and so on, had the greatest right to it. And they were going to defend it to the very limits.
Prior to the arrival of the white settlers, the Native Americans were enjoying life as they had always known it, planting their crops, fishing, hunting, and nurturing their families as they had always done for generations.
While the Shawnees, Iroquois, and other tribes welcomed trade with the whites, they showed no interest in surrendering their beloved territory to the new settlers.
The English settlers were a great threat to the Indian possessions and to the Indian way of life, because the English had an empire that was based upon agriculture, the production of goods, trade, and settlement.
Meanwhile, France, at odds with England, proved herself a friend to Native Americans.
The French came in
and they more or less assumed the Indian way of life. They did not take land. They came in to trade for furs.
And since British gain would be great loss for the Indians, they chose to join the French when war erupted in 1754.
They engaged in war solely for preservation of life as they had known it, preservation of the land that they so loved.
About 450 Western Virginians joined British forces under General Edward Braddock at the outset of the French and Indian War.
They were so accustomed to fighting for what they wanted that they were ready psychologically to do battle with the Indians for the land.
The British, though, were not quite ready to war against the Indians. Braddock's European approach to battle had no place in the American wilderness. It cost him his life. As soldiers fell by the hundreds, the Western Virginians were forced to turn to the guerrilla warfare tactics of their foe to survive. The mountaineers' resourcefulness enabled a young colonel, George Washington, to organize a retreat. The British defeat sparked fighting between Indians and frontiersmen that lasted for 8 blood-soaked years.
The war chiefs began to realize that the only way they were going to keep the white people from crowding in was to demolish their forts and so terrorize them that they would go back over the mountains.
British Rangers learned from past mistakes and adopted guerrilla war tactics. These troops joined the mountaineers to subdue the Indians, burning crops, devastating villages, claiming lives, and crushing the Native American spirit. Tribes in the Ohio Valley were on the verge of starving by the end of 1763. The Indians, forced to live by the white man's terms, were now unable to prevent white families from settling west of the Alleghenies. The typical mountaineer family surviving the French and Indian War had become thoroughly familiar with guerrilla warfare. Each boy at age 12 received a rifle and became a fort soldier. Daughters and mothers fended off enemy attackers with skill, wit, and scalding water. An Indian chief once spared a woman's life after she courageously killed an attacking brave. Frontiersmen, legend has it, worked the land with an axe in one hand and a gun in the other. The backwoods militia was a military force to be reckoned with. In 1774, tensions again mounted in Western Virginia.
The English settlers now felt reasonably secure, and they were ready to advance their frontiers. There was only one obstacle: the Indians.
The Indians had no intention of turning the entire region over to the white settlers. The Indian Confederacy of the Ohio wilderness would rather fight. John Murray, Earl of Dunmore and British Governor of Virginia, also chose to fight. He declared war upon the tribes.
And there had been a number of attacks both ways, whites against the Indians and Indians against the whites. The whole frontier seemed about to burst into flames.
2,500 militiamen mobilized for Dunmore's war. The governor himself directed nearly half the troops to the upper shores of the Ohio, now the site of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And Colonel Andrew Lewis led 1,000 backwoodsmen into the Kanawha Valley.
The idea was that they would converge somewhere on the Ohio River and make a dash into the Indian country with a force of 2,000 plus men.
Shawnee Chief Cornstalk, aware of troop movements, chose to attack Lewis first near Point Pleasant.
And on the night of October the 9th of 1774, about 800 to 1,000 Indians under Cornstalk arrived, and the result was a battle that lasted all day.
It was one of the bloodiest and most violent confrontations on the American frontier, with more than 2,000 white and Indian warriors fighting hand-to-hand from dawn to dusk. The battle ended after Cornstalk mistook a group of militiamen to be fresh reinforcements. The braves withdrew immediately. The Indian Confederacy sued for peace and surrendered all territory south of the Ohio River, including all of Western Virginia. The Battle of Point Pleasant provides a rough sketch of the Western Virginia frontiersmen.
They were a bunch of tough cookies, tramping 250 miles along wilderness trails to fight Indians at Point Pleasant.
For example, it took 2 shots in the left arm and 1 in the chest to force Colonel William Fleming from the battlefield.
His lung came through the hole in his chest, and he kept trying to get that back in there, and he got people to try to help him, and he couldn't. And so after about a day, he finally got that lung pushed back through himself. He did that.
Fleming miraculously survived, living to serve as Virginia's acting governor in 1781. The men under the colonel at Point Pleasant admired him for his courage and stamina, but the backwoodsmen had little respect for his rank. They obeyed only so far as it suited them.
The people who lived out here at that time were the ones who didn't particularly like authority and had come into the wilderness to get away from it.
They didn't have much discipline, but when it came to fighting the Indians, they get right in there hand-to-hand fighting.
Fighting for their lives and for their country. Years of fighting and working alongside neighbors would eventually lead these frontiersmen to lay aside their own wishes for the good of the many. A number of these very men would later serve as statesmen in a nation dependent on strong and caring leaders. Veterans of Dunmore's War met at Fort Gower, north of Point Pleasant, within a month of the battle. The mountaineers had been aware of the growing tide against British interference in the eastern colonies for some time. The soldiers quickly declared this position to King George of England.
As attachment to the real interests and just rights of America outweigh every other consideration, we resolved that we will exert every power within us for the defense of American liberty, when regularly called forth by the unanimous voice of our countrymen.
At the start of the War for Independence, backwoods fighters marched 600 miles in less than a month to confront the British in Massachusetts. These Western Virginia riflemen became the first soldiers to be inducted into the United States Army. General George Washington personally greeted them. He'd fought alongside a few of them during the French and Indian War, and once said that any 10 soldiers from the West were worth 100 British regulars. Legend has it that Washington looked to the hills of Western Virginia during the darkest days of the Revolution.
Leave me but a banner to plant upon the mountains of West Augusta, and I will gather around me the men who will lift our bleeding country from the dust and set her free.
Future President John Adams called the Western Virginia Riflemen an excellent species of infantry. President John Hancock of the Continental Congress noted that these excellent marksmen were able to send sure destruction to great distance. Congressmember Richard Henry Lee added, "There is not one of them who wish a distance less than 200 yards or a larger object than an orange. Every shot is fatal." General George Rogers Clark, a veteran of Dunmore's War, led Western Virginians in attacks on British forts west of the Mississippi River in 1778.
He knew these people were accustomed to living off the land. He knew that they could endure a great deal of swift travel, and they were accustomed to suffering, which you had to be able to bear pretty well.
The army of 150 struggled through dense forests and water up to their waist in the dead of winter. Brigadier General Daniel Morgan of Berkeley County personified the Western Virginia Riflemen. Known for his fiery temper and sensitivity to criticism, Big Dan fought with furious courage. British forces set out to crush Morgan in 1781, but he outwitted them with the best planned, best fought battle of the Revolution, the Battle of Cowpens. Seasoned Virginia riflemen joined Continental troops in the rear, as Morgan placed South Carolina militiamen on the front line. The British charged forward when the militia appeared to retreat.
The ones that were falling back were fanning out to the side, and then they were able to attack the flanks of the attacking force and put them to rout real quick.
Morgan galloped along the lines, cheering his troops on and instructing them to hold their fire till they could see the whites of the enemy's eyes. The defeat cost the British the Carolinas, while the victory earned Morgan a gold medal from the Continental Congress. As mountaineers defended the eastern colonies, Indian attacks on Western Virginia settlements resumed. The British now befriended the Indians with rum and offered a bounty on American scalps.
Most families lived under more or less constant fear of Indian attack.
Men and women fought side by side. 16-year-old Lydia Kruger of Ohio County blistered her hands with molten lead while shaping bullets. Fearless Ann Bailey is said to have fended off attackers while riding night and day, delivering gunpowder and news throughout the Kanawha Valley. Legend has it that the need for gunpowder once drove Betty Zane to leave the safety of Fort Henry near Wheeling, exposing herself to attacking Indians.
They were so surprised that they did not even fire at her. But at any rate, she made it to the house, got the gunpowder, and then made the dash back safely and saved the fort.
Many white settlers owed their lives to their black servants. Dick Pointer was among a number of slaves who earned the respect of their masters while defending settlements.
Inside Donnelly's fort, one of the messengers, and Dick Pointer, who happened to be a slave of Colonel Donnelly, who owned the fort, were able to exert their weight against the barrels in the door and to hold off the invaders until the men could get to their positions to give battle.
Greenbrier County residents asked Virginia to grant Pointer his freedom for his bravery. The legislature refused. It was 13 years after the British surrender at Yorktown before the black and white settlers of Western Virginia were able to put the war for independence behind them. It took General Anthony Wayne's victory in the Battle of Fallen Timbers to convince Britain to relinquish all posts on the western frontier. Without England's support, Indian attacks on the mountaineers' settlements became increasingly rare. More men, women, and children had died at the hands of the Indians in Western Virginia than white settlers anywhere else in America at that time. British muskets were again found in 1812 at the scene of Indian attacks in the Ohio Valley. A second war with England became imminent.
Here in West Virginia, there was a pretty strong support for the war. And there was a feeling that we had suffered enough at the hands of the British.
U.S. Congressman Charles Fenton Mercer sang the praises of the Western Virginia Volunteers.
At the cry of invasion and danger from the east, every man of the West, from the summit of the Blue Ridge to the shores of the Ohio, capable of bearing arms, mounted his horse, strapped on his knapsack, and turned his face from home. Their course was turned to their mountains only when danger had ceased.
Patriotism abounded throughout Western Virginia. A number of mountaineers defended the East Coast, while many served under future President William Henry Harrison in the Northwest Territory. Cabell County riflemen, in the Battle of New Orleans, had no trouble picking off British soldiers. The white belts across their uniforms made perfect targets. The British invasion of Washington, D.C. prompted so many mountaineers to volunteer that most were sent home due to a lack of supplies. The war served as a catalyst for industrial growth in Western Virginia. Hancock County cannonballs were used in the Battle of Lake Erie. Iron ore, coal, salt, blankets, and homespun clothing also fired the war on the home front.
The War of 1812 was an enormous stimulant because the British supplies from the West Indies were cut off.
A truce ended the Second War with England in 1814. Fighting with Indians in the region diminished as the number of whites and blacks rose to over 157,000. Native Americans were forced to either move westward or embrace the mountaineers' culture.
A lot of the Indians, Native Americans, went into hiding because they didn't want to leave this land that they so loved.
Many chose to deny their heritage rather than be forever sentenced to exile. Today, their descendants proudly serve the U.S. to preserve their country, their freedom. They serve alongside other West Virginians, other Americans, with honor. A territorial dispute in 1846 led to war between the United States and Mexico.
The notion that the Almighty himself had intended for the white races to occupy North America that swept across the country, and West Virginians were caught up in it.
Again, more Western Virginians volunteered for military service than were needed. Colonel John Hamtramck of Jefferson County led mountaineers to the battlefield. They considered it an honor to be called into action. Hamtramck served as military governor in Mexico after the war. West Point graduates Jesse Reno of Ohio County and Thomas J. Jackson of Lewis County also served honorably. Jackson later became well known as Stonewall in the Civil War.
Jackson was exceedingly ambitious. Jackson was not the bumbling frontiersman that many writers try to paint him. He had upward mobility in mind.
No other Army officer advanced in rank more rapidly than did Jackson. The lieutenant is most noted for his actions during the storming of the Mexican fortress at Chapultepec.
Jackson was out in front of the main army, or the main force, and he was literally heaving a cannon. I mean, physically picking a cannon up and carrying it over to a more advantageous place where he could blast the Mexicans away from the causeway that prevented others to rush for the gates.
Jackson tried to rally his troops. "Come on," he cried. "There is no danger at all. See, I am not hit." Just then a cannonball went rolling between his legs.
Seemingly, when he got into battle, he was absolutely fearless. Jackson also was totally devoted to what he was doing. He was the soldier's soldier.
The enemy quickly lost heart in the decisive battle. The war with Mexico ended weeks later.
We must make an issue, create an event, and establish a position for ourselves. It is glorious to think of, but far more glorious to carry out. Martin Delany, 1853.
In 1859, abolitionist John Brown took possession of the federal arsenal in Jefferson County. Western Virginia militiamen subdued the small force, allowing U.S. Marines under Colonel Robert E. Lee to capture Brown. The abolitionists' attempt to stockpile arms fueled the nationwide debate over slavery, economics, and states' rights to determine their own destinies.
When the war came, most West Virginians, even though they deplored the breaking up of the Union in many cases, most of them quickly chose sides, even if it meant splitting the families.
When North and South came apart, she came apart right where West Virginia is.
You would have sons marching off to Union armies, others going to the Confederates.
It was truly brother against brother.
Once the decision was made, they entered into the affair with an enormous enthusiasm and with a confidence of victory.
Major Thomas Brown of Kanawha County put his law practice aside to defend the South.
I feel proud that I have the health and energy to be useful in this war. I go into it might and main, relying upon the justice of our cause and the guidance of an overruling providence as guarantees for our success. I feel conscious that a people never had a better cause to fight for.
Sarah Young of Kanawha County watched the war unfold on the home front as her father fought for the Union.
Oh, when will we enjoy the blessings of peace? I fear not until many more brave and gallant soldiers fall on the battlefield. Our dear soldiers who have offered their lives upon the altar of liberty. Oh, God, give them victory.
Western Virginia's strategic location quickly brought the Civil War to mountaineers' doorsteps.
Once the war started, the life for civilians here was not to be the same for 4 years.
The region's major railways and turnpikes made for efficient movement of troops and supplies. Both sides needed the Kanawha River salt works, and the Union sought to divide the already fragile state of Virginia.
This was valuable territory, and there was so much fighting here. There were probably, conservatively speaking, about 800 or 900 battles, skirmishes, and campaigns that occurred on soil that is today West Virginia.
Northern and Southern armies alike often called on Western Virginians for supplies while en route to distant battlefields.
You might be raided by Union soldiers today and raided by hungry Confederates tomorrow. This would leave the families nearly destitute, and the military authorities would routinely confiscate farm animals, and that would leave the farmers without the animals to work the farms and to produce the food and to keep their families going.
The restored government of Virginia under Francis Pierpont and the Old Dominion competed for Western Virginia's resources.
You might have a group of competitors come along in the morning and say, well, you guys haven't paid your taxes to Richmond. Only have another troop come along in the afternoon and say, hey, you guys haven't paid your taxes to Pierpont and Wheeling.
Men and women living in Western Virginia were frequently arrested on grounds that they were enemy sympathizers.
They were arrested by the North, they were arrested by the South, some were arrested by both over and over again.
The need to protect the home sometimes drove mountaineers to jump the fence. A number of Putnam County men, for instance, joined the Federal Army less than 3 months after pledging allegiance to the South in 1861.
These guys joined to defend their homes in May. When the Confederate Army left, they were no longer defending their homes, so they came back and joined the Union Army and defended their home.
More than 40,000 mountaineers entered the war, as many as 19,000 fighting for the Union, including over 200 African Americans. Dr. Martin Delany, in the forefront of black nationalism, had called on the North to organize a totally black unit. In 1865, President Abraham Lincoln commissioned Delany a major, the first and highest-ranking Negro officer in the Union Army. The efforts of the Jefferson County native enabled thousands to join the fight. The war itself reached Western Virginia soil in May 1861, when Private T. Bailey Brown fell dead in Taylor County. Brown and another Union soldier were ordered to halt by a Confederate sentry near Grafton. Brown refused.
He said, damn him, what right does he have to stop us? T. Bailey Brown pulled his pistol and shot at the sentry, hitting him in the ear. Unfortunately, the sentry, being a better marksman than T. Bailey Brown, shot him through the heart.
The Taylor County native instantly became the first American to die in the Civil War. Union forces avenged Brown's death a week later by routing the Confederates near Philippi. The rebel soldiers fled the scene so quickly that this first land battle of the war became known as the Philippi Races. Former Virginia Governor John B. Floyd later routed Yankee troops controlling the center of Western Virginia. The Confederate general then established a stronghold atop Carnifax Ferry in Nicholas County.
He effectively cut off communication between the Kanawha Valley and the northwestern section of West Virginia by way of the turnpike.
It took 6,000 federal troops to dislodge the rebels. The Battle of Carnifax Ferry was among the first in which Western Virginians heatedly fought former neighbors.
They were fighting on opposite sides in a conflict over areas where they had grown up on or farmed or worked as young men. And this was quite a unique experience for them.
2 future presidents fought for the North in the battle. Colonel Rutherford B. Hayes became commander-in-chief in 1877. Private William McKinley took office 20 years later. Both served in the Ohio Volunteer Infantry. Southern forces sought to destroy Western Virginia's railroad system in 1863 while acquiring supplies and recruits. Confederate General John M. Bowdoin planned to sabotage the region's move toward statehood as well. The raid succeeded from a military standpoint, but President Lincoln succeeded politically by signing the 35th state into being despite rebel efforts. His actions secured federal support in the region and permitted greater access to West Virginia's strategic resources.
That act itself was unprecedented, the dividing of an existing state into 2 separate states without the consent of the mother state.
It's the only state that was created in part as a result of the war.
That act prompted Confederate General Henry A. Wise, who was also a former governor of Virginia, to proclaim that West Virginia had been torn from its moorings of statehood without rhyme or reason and was the bastard offspring of political rape.
Mountaineers, men, women, and children, gallantly represented their homeland in the Great Rebellion. Nancy Hart of Roane County earned a reputation as a guerrilla fighter and spy for the South. The 16-year-old often played the part of an innocent, backwoods girl to obtain enemy secrets and to escape capture. Belle Boyd of Berkeley County also spied for the Confederacy. Dubbed the Siren of the South, she was known for her charm and sassy spirit. Belle, at 17, killed a drunken Union soldier after he insulted and threatened her secessionist mother on Independence Day, 1861.
I could stand it no longer. My indignation was aroused beyond my control. My blood was literally boiling in my veins. I drew out my pistol and shot him.
She later provided intelligence leading to a surprise attack on Front Royal, Virginia, led by her close friend, Brigadier General Stonewall Jackson. The state's highest-ranking Confederate officer brought glory to the South, to his men, and to himself. Thomas J. Jackson earned the title Stonewall while commanding his troops with rock-steady nerve at the First Battle of Bull Run. Jackson defeated an army of 16,000 Federals with 6,500 rebels.
His name will be forever inscribed in the annals of military history.
Jackson just had the knack of moving troops fast over considerable distances and getting them ready to fight.
Stonewall possessed an uncanny ability to discern topography and to seemingly read the minds of his opponents.
Jackson was mortally wounded, unintentionally, by his own troops in 1863. West Virginia's highest-ranking Union officer also suffered a mortal wound just months before Jackson. Major General Jesse Reno of Ohio County died cheering his men on to victory. Over 4,000 mountaineers gave their lives in the Civil War. Many never reached their 22nd birthday. 39 federal soldiers representing the Mountain State earned the Congressional Medal of Honor in the war. 3 medals went to flag bearers, those soldiers who were carrying the American flag in combat. 12 medals were presented for capturing the Southern flag. The soldier who managed to capture and hold on to the enemy's colors was highly respected by both sides.
He was generally in the thick of things, and to be able to get into his line and in among the people where he was with and take the flag from him, or to shoot him and take his flag before someone shot you, was quite a feat.
9 other West Virginia volunteers earned the Medal of Honor during the siege of Vicksburg in 1863 while attempting to storm rebel troops.
There was a lot of fighting, a lot of dying, a lot of bloodshed, but they really didn't do much more than just storm the lines, and then when the fighting's over, everything stabilized.
Mountaineers on both sides longed to return to the hills in peace. Yankee soldier John Valley Young of St. Albans was among the war-weary.
Dear Pauline, we intend to make our mark wherever we go, as long as there is a traitor left in Virginia. But I want to see home. I want to be in your arms. When I think of the happiness I have enjoyed with my dear wife and children, and remember who it is that deprived me of those blessings, I grow indignant and feel like exterminating the last rebel that has given aid or comfort to the rebellion.
By the end of the war in 1865, mountaineers were ready to pursue a peaceful and progressive future for West Virginia.
Everything is pushing ahead here. To be sure, this community is made up of returned Confederates, Yankees, Federal soldiers, Negroes, rebel sympathizers, and intensely Union men. But the war being over, the energies of all are being turned to making money in search of oil, coal land, and the like. Thomas Brown, 1865.
Major Theodore Lang of Harrison County fought for the North. 30 years later, he reflected on the war's impact upon the people.
The hot blood of those days has now cooled by the lapse of years. The war demonstrated the fact that the soldiers North and South were American soldiers, and the courage and prowess of both were tested on many a battlefield.
After more than 3 decades of peace, America again prepared for war. This time, Spain became the foe as the United States sought to defend the rights of Cubans and Filipinos to govern themselves. Over 3,000 West Virginians immediately responded to the call to arms. Captain French Ensign Chadwick of Monongalia County commanded the American fleet's flagship, New York. Chadwick later served as Rear Admiral in the First World War. John Hill resigned as principal of the West Virginia Colored Institute in Kanawha County and joined more than 200 other black mountaineers in the brief war. President William McKinley commissioned Hill an officer in the U.S. Army. First Lieutenant Hill, considered the war's most outstanding black officer, returned to the Institute after the war and served as commandant of a newly formed cadet corps. Lee Sennett of Grant County joined the cavalry under Teddy Roosevelt's command only 11 days after the declaration of war. The 21-year-old private risked court-martial when he deserted his stateside unit. Sennett stowed away with the first troops bound for Cuba, guaranteeing him a position on the firing line. The mountaineer returned to the States after the war and received a hero's welcome. Lieutenant Andrew Summers Rowan of Monroe County drew worldwide attention after President McKinley sent him to estimate the strength and determination of Cuban insurgents. Rowan voluntarily risked capture, traveling deep into enemy territory and through thick jungles. He successfully contacted Cuban General Calito Garcia and earned the Distinguished Service Cross. Biographer Elbert Hubbard praised the West Virginian in the essay, A Message to Garcia.
There is a man whose form should be cast in deathless bronze and the statue placed in every college of the land. It is not book learning young men need, nor instruction about this and that, but a stiffening of the vertebrae which will cause them to be loyal to a trust, to act promptly, concentrate their energies, do the thing, carry a message to Garcia.
As mountaineers proved themselves again on foreign soil, West Virginia again showed itself to be an invaluable resource in wartime. Mountain State Coal, for instance, has been credited with America's victory at Manila Bay. U.S. ships using the smokeless coal were able to approach Spanish vessels virtually unnoticed.
There's a tradition that we won the Spanish-American War, coal miners in southern West Virginia, as a result of cranking out the fuel that made America able to achieve its national interests.
Attacks on American merchant ships drove the U.S. to declare war on Germany in 1917. Governor John Jacob Cornwell of Hampshire County called on mountaineers to come to the aid of the nation.
The country is engaged in the most stupendous war of the ages. A great army is being created. West Virginia is expected to do its part. We must go forward energetically and courageously and be willing to make any sacrifice that properly falls to us.
And sacrifice they did. West Virginians purchased $128 million worth of war bonds. They planted gardens to save food for the troops. Daughters and mothers joined the Red Cross and other organizations to support the war effort. They knitted garments for refugees and raised money to aid the war's orphans. Women also entered the workforce as their sons and husbands went to war. West Virginia developed a higher percentage of fighting men than any other state. Millard Saunders was hard at work in Boone County before America entered the First World War.
I wasn't paying too much attention to it then, for I was working in the coal mines. But after the war was declared, I came out of the mines and went in the Army.
Newton Baker of Berkeley County directed the Army as Secretary of War. He sought quick, decisive action on the part of the U.S. in dealing with Germany. Baker needed, as he put it, a soldier true to a soldier's duty. To serve as General of the Army, he chose John Blackjack Pershing. The general followed Washington's example in the American Revolution and looked to the hills for support.
General Pershing said, if you give me men from West Virginia, Virginia, and Pennsylvania, I can whip the world.
General J.S. Jones of Ohio County served as Pershing's Chief of Staff. General Mason Patrick of Greenbrier County served as Chief of the Air Service, developing the nation's air defense during and after the war. But no other soldier advanced in rank more rapidly than John Hines from Greenbrier County. He went to France a major and returned a Major General. Hines later replaced Pershing as General of the Army. Over 45,000 West Virginians joined the armed forces. Nearly 700 died in training. An influenza epidemic prevented many soldiers, including Private Millard Saunders, from leaving camp stateside.
My company went off and left me, and there were two of my best friends didn't get back. And he shook me up pretty well, because we went to school together.
Lieutenant Charles Frampton of Cabell County expected the worst after a grenade explosion while training in France.
Lieutenant Scott McCormick lay dying, both legs shattered, one arm gone, and his abdomen shattered. A piece of flesh 6 or 8 inches long had blown into my overcoat and was hanging out. A fella, seeing my bloody face in the flesh, said, "My God, it got you too, didn't it?" Thinking my guts were blown out, I held McCormick's head until he had breathed his last.
Nearly 27,000 mountaineers served overseas in the war. Harper Shoemate of Wyoming County remembers a general's advice to soldiers in training.
He said, you boys want to take all the training you possibly can get and do it right, because you're going to live in hell.
Private Shoemate, a machine gunner, was severely gassed during the decisive Meuse-Argonne offensive. The Germans, early in the war, had introduced trench warfare, claiming enemy territory inch by bloody inch.
And the only way you could get them out was to blast them out with high-velocity shells and guns. And so it took a lot of gunpowder.
War Secretary Baker called for 3 stateside locations to produce the much-needed substance. The abundant resources of the Kanawha Valley impressed Baker. The valley, beyond the danger of enemy attack, also provided excellent rail and river transportation. One town there, Nitro, West Virginia, sprang to life in 11 months. Schools, churches, amusement centers, hotels, houses, and a hospital were built for workers and their families. More than 20,000 people arrived almost overnight.
It's just amazing to know that that much good can be done when it's a united effort.
A naval ordnance plant in South Charleston produced steel armor plate, gun forgings, and projectiles. The United States replaced Germany as the world's largest supplier of chemicals, produced mostly here in West Virginia. The Mountain State also fueled the war with 180 million tons of coal. The war began to cool in the winter of 1918. Newton Baker praised the nation as the Great War ended.
We Americans have a full cup of happiness and pride from the effort our nation has made. Our country has been more at one in the past year than any year I can remember, and I trust that the new understandings which have been created will cement us together for the work of the future, which will be harder to do because the setting will be less heroic.
West Virginia welcomed her mountaineers home with pride. The citizens of McDowell County, for instance, erected the only memorial in the United States exclusively devoted to black veterans of the Great War, the First World War.